I'm Braxton McCoy, and this is the Behind the Woodshed podcast. Today I'm sitting down with my buddy Josh. He's a professor at a university here in the Rocky Mountain West. Very knowledgeable guy. We're talking about public lands, the future of them, and the need to preserve them, at least in our opinion, in perpetuity. As always, none of our shows could be possible without our friends at papabearnaturals.com. At Papa Bear Naturals. The website is thepapabear.com. This is their fluoride-free toothpaste. I use it every morning. Works great. They also make chemical-free soaps, deodorants, all kinds of personal hygiene products. Family-owned business. Seem like great people. We're happy to have them on board with us. Thank you for watching. Oh, and also, if you would like to support this show or our shooting videos, you can do so at patreon.com/behindthewoodshed. We're going to start, a lot of companies are mailing me stuff now, scopes, optics, different stuff like that. As soon as we get done filming videos with some of those optics, we're going to start giving it away to people on Patreon. So there's another incentive. Thank you, as always, for your continued support and for watching the show. All right. I was thinking before you showed up, I was actually trying to remember exactly where I met you first, because I know we mostly met through a conservation organization in Utah. But is that how we met? Was through that?
I feel like we might have interacted on via email or social media.
That's what it was.
But then I remember distinctly there was an event and we had parked. You had driven up from southern Utah. It was in Salt Lake. Mm-hmm. And you were walking up in your cowboy duds and $1 Million Cowboy. And I saw you in the driveway, and we visited for a while.
Yeah.
And I felt like that's when we kind of became friends. That meeting, but even before that in the driveway, and I felt a connection to you then that I was like, oh yeah, this guy gets it. And that's my earliest memory.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think we were BSing on a social media or email. I can't remember which, but it was something to do with a public land issue in Utah. I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the event you're talking about, if I remember correctly, was the one where we were at a wealthy, influential Mormon guy's house, and one of the ladies decided to start talking shit about Mormonism. Okay,
that was the one. Okay. That's exactly the one.
Okay.
Yeah,
that was enjoyable.
Down on the East Bench, which is a particular neighborhood in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, and if you're an outdoorsman at all, you would know one of the companies that he owns for sure. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Yeah, so we've been friends for 8 years or something now.
I think it's exactly 8 years old because I started getting involved in public land conservation advocacy the year my daughter was born, and she just turned 8. Oh. And really the impetus for me was, I've hunted and fished my whole life, but I had her older in life. I was 39 when she was born. And I remember that year just in my mind, I said, I don't want to take away from this new baby and this experience. And I kind of told myself I'm not going to hunt this season, which is the first season maybe since I was, 4 or 5 or 6 that I hadn't hunted. And the advocacy portion kind of filled that hunting need for me in a way.
I see.
And so I think that first year, 2016, I might have deer hunted 2 days the entire season, and that was it. And that was obviously a lot less than I've ever had, but that was really when I started ramping up. And you were there, right then at that same time. You were one of the first people I met, actually, and I think our connection was based on the fact that I was sort of in this urban setting, and you were coming from this very rural setting. But we saw eye to eye on a couple key issues that mattered to us, and so yeah, that was probably 2016.
Yeah, I think was that the year you just bow hunted the extended?
I did deer hunt I rifle hunted a couple. When I say 2 days, that's driving 3-4 hours, camping out. I think I rifle hunted for 2-3 days, and then the extended in Salt Lake's easy because it's 20 minutes from home, so Like if I go up at 4 and come back at 9, I don't even really consider that like.
Yeah.
I'm talking about like going away and kind of like being
yeah.
out of touch for 3 days kind of thing.
For anybody who doesn't know, that Utah, it used to be a great hunt. I don't know how
Still
it is
a
now.
good hunt.
Okay.
It's mobbed, but it's still.
I figured it.
Yeah.
It kind of caught on before, like everybody knew about it. They had this extended archery hunt. So you could hunt rut and bucks in December with your bow. You'd like be above the Salt Lake Valley, so like you're over here on the bench, and you like hear lions roaring at the zoo and shit when you're up there. Like, it was pretty wild.
It really, the Wasatch. I mean, the dirty little secret is it's a sanctuary for a lot of big game. I mean, not just ungulates, but predators as well. Just because there's so much urbanization, but then those elk still need to come out of the high country. Those deer still come out, and they're chasing does that are living in Cottonwood Heights, eating shrubs all summer, and it's a hard hunt because one, the people, and two, everything's steep. It's scrub oak, it's a tough hunt. But like guys that are serious about it, they kill monster buck and bull, and lots of does and cows as well, which it's a great meat harvest for sure.
Yeah, the biggest buck I ever killed I don't know if he died or not. I lost him, unfortunately, but was basically kind of above Hogle Zoo.
Oh,
there.
really?
He was a freaking stud, dude.
Yeah.
Oh, man. We went, and in fact, I hit him in the shoulder, which always sucks, and I shot a mechanical that year, which I regret. I really think if I'd have shot a fixed, I would have been okay.
Yeah.
But that mechanical just opened up and hit. It was just like, anyway, my brother-in-law, I think it might have been the first year I ever did anything with him. We went up looking for him on Thanksgiving morning, and my wife now, girlfriend at the time, was like, you didn't have service down in as you're hiking up, but once you get up top, you could get service. I get up there and I got text, don't you dare be late, and we got fogged in up there and sort of sitting up there bullshitting, like with a fire, like watching, waiting to look for this deer.
Right.
And we ended up finding him, and he was up rutting. It was crazy.
Huh.
He was fighting with this other buck. I'm like, that's him for sure. And you could see the blood, And another year on that hunt, a buddy of mine shot a 2-point buck that ran downhill and jumped over a little fence and died on this dude's pool cover.
Come on.
Big, oh, yeah.
Are you serious?
Dead serious. He's like laying there kicking on the pool cover. It was not good.
Yeah.
So he has to go knock on the door like, hey, excuse me.
Hopefully the homeowner was a hunter, at least understood. No? Oh, gosh.
No, did not go very well.
Did the CO get pulled in?
No, he talked. This guy is quite a character. I don't want to tell too many. I'll tell you some offline stories about him. I think he got him talked into. I know he got him talked into taking it, but I don't think it was the politest of conversations. Anyway, that hunt used to be awesome. Pretty wild stories up there. But it's good country, and there are big deer. Big.
I mean, they. Again, I know a couple guys that just kind of being in the hunting community in Utah, and a lot of these guys will post on social media and stuff, but they kill 180, 200-inch deer there consecutively, and how hard it is to kill a big mule deer year after year. I mean, much harder in my opinion than an elk, and I love to elk hunt. It's my favorite. But there are some just absolute studs that I don't know how they do it. To be honest, it's impressive.
My brother-in-law every year has got some 200+ inch buck. He's sending me videos of every single year. I'm not saying it's always on that unit, but
yeah.
All right, so I told you I got you a gift. Since we're talking about hunting, my buddy Chris started this company. He's a guide or an outfitter, and it's called Cake Mate.
I'm not familiar.
It's brand new. So what he did is how every time you shoot a buck or a bull on the archery hunt, even rifle hunt for sure, but on the archery hunt, like up here in Idaho, we don't have to wear orange even on the rifle hunts. But I always throw orange in because once I shoot something, I stretch it across the antlers so some dummy doesn't shoot me. I've got like a tan mystery ranch pack. I just don't want to get blasted. Anyway, it's designed so that when you cape an animal out, you slide the nose in the front. There's like this pouch for it.
Okay.
And then you roll that up and the hide up, and then it's got like a VS or like a VTAC panel kind of deal.
Okay.
So you've got a big orange thing back there, but it keeps your hide all rolled up nice and clean.
Yeah.
It's freaking sweet, and it'll strap like to your pack and stuff.
And this will do a deer and elk?
Yeah, it's designed for both. It's big enough for elk, and you can use a deer too.
Oh, interesting. So I was pretty fortunate. I drew a decent tag last year in Utah and killed a pretty good bull with my bow. And I took the cape out because I didn't know if I wanted to get it mounted.
Right.
I mean, I don't really have the room for it in my house, but I took it out.
Too many books.
8-foot ceilings don't help, but there are a few books. But I shot it. I shot it at last light on like a Friday, quartered it that night, hiked back to my camp, got back there the next morning, took the meat off the bone, put it in the game sacks. By the time we got it out, I was probably 3.5 from my truck. And then, 4-hour drive back to Salt Lake City. I had to work the next day. I'd been in the woods for like 5-6 days straight. And so I didn't actually end up dealing with them, even though the meat had been on ice in the cooler and the cape was in there. I physically, I didn't have enough hours in the day. And I took that head and the cape into the taxidermist, and he didn't even have to touch the hair. He's like, that's already, it's done.
It's soured.
And what he told me, and this was interesting, I didn't know this, but he said, I can get you an elk cape any day of the week. He goes, if you kill a good buck, don't ever leave the cape, because those are much, much harder to come by. And so for me in my head, I'm like, elk cape, I don't know. Deer cape, I'll never leave after he told me that.
It's one of those things that kind of, we're going to talk about public lands, but this sort of falls a little bit in that vein, and then it's one of those things that kind of skirts the rules, because it's illegal to sell wildlife products, but for some reason you can sell a cape because it's been fleshed and it's I forget exactly the way it's worded, but it's a worked product.
Sure.
And the reason that kind of gets grandfathered in is because Indians.
Oh, interesting.
Like if it wasn't for natives making stuff, drums and whatever else, painting skulls and all this, we probably
shed
wouldn't.
Antlers, yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
So you can sell, so far as I'm aware, some of us maybe, whatever the statute of limitations are, have done this many times as poor youth.
Yeah.
Like you shoot and especially you shoot a mature buck, but maybe I actually don't really shoulder mount anything, but you shoot a mature buck and maybe he's, a 150 4-point, you're not going to put him on the wall.
Right.
But he's still a big mature buck.
Yeah.
So you got a good hide, and you sell that to a taxidermist. I can tell you the prices if you want.
I mean, I wouldn't leave a deer cape after you told me that.
No.
And
sorry.
I think you can sell them like, I don't even think they have to be tan, do they? Can you sell them green? Yeah.
Well, they've been worked,
Oh. Huh.
I mean, theoretically, they've been fleshed and all that, so it's a worked product.
Interesting. Okay, yeah.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, no, that's great.
This is not legal advice. Some game wardens out there are like, shut up.
That's funny.
Yeah. But, so, for years, you and I have been, more you recently for sure. I'm just like a social media mouthpiece about it at this point, but we've been on this whole public lands kick. I think in 2016 it was really, not to be offensive to some people, but it was really like Mike Lee, Ted Cruz. They were pushing this PLI, Public Lands Initiative. They wanted to transfer, cede this ground back to the states, which is a common refrain. You hear this. I mean, even to this day, you keep hearing it. And the idea was Utah has, around 68%?
More than that. I think it's 80% if you include state lands.
Oh, okay.
SITLA. I think it's around 65% federal land.
Right.
Utah doesn't like to include the 15 or 20% that they own, but 80% I think is the number for Utah public land ownership.
Yeah. And so what would you say to someone? I have a good friend who's friends with Mike Lee. Actually, I have a Twitter buddy who's is buddies with him too. Uh, what would you say to somebody that said, well, Mike makes some, or Senator Lee makes some really good points with this whole, we can manage it better, right? That's the kind of the centerpiece
Sure.
of what they'll say. So if you would just cede us this 60% of supposedly, now owned is a very loaded term. You know, when someone says federal government owns, it's like, I know that's been through the Supreme Court twice, but even still, it's a pretty loaded. There's some dispute as to whether it's really manage or own.
Sure.
And that's getting really into the weeds, so probably don't worry about that. So we'll just go with the colloquial, which is own.
Yeah.
Someone like him would say Utah would be able to manage this better for resource extraction, recreation, essentially the multiple use mandate.
Sure.
They'd be able to do it better than the feds. So just give it back to us, and we'll do whatever we decide to do.
Yeah. I mean, you can come at this a couple different ways. I think, and I guess what I'm about to say, you know, is exacerbated by, like, just modern politics, right? It's just become so dichotomous and acrimonious, and, you know, people end up taking these very hardline positions and without seeing this whole nuance and gray, I think, that comes with something like, what does multiple use mandate mean for, you know, a chunk of BLM property? Mm-hmm. And so somebody like Mike Lee, just to give a recent example, we can go back, you know, 2016 when you remember Jason Chaffetz tried to dispose 3 million federal dispose is the word they use to say sell, 3 million acres in the state of Utah, and it met with a lot of opposition. The PLI, obviously, shortly before that, which we could get into if you wanted to. But the most recent example, take you know, a politician like Mike Lee, and he's, I think, representative of a, you know, a Western politician who has obviously states' rights in mind, and, you know, less government. You know, you can go on down the list, but Salt Lake right now is just like experiencing exponential growth in terms of like housing development, and there's just not a lot of places for people to live. And so I think 2 years was the first year he introduced the House bill. I forget what that acronym stands for, but the idea was that he would, and in theory, it's not a bad idea, I think, on face value, that they would sell off parcels of federal land, mostly BLM land, because that's the range land that kind of abuts some of these outlying communities, you know, in
That's not how they would frame it, though. They would say it's worthless land.
100%, right? And I would say 60%, 70% make up a number of people that live adjacent to these lands would say it's worthless because they don't find value in, well, one, sage lands in general. They don't see the amount of life and vibrancy that's happening in it. They don't understand that it's its own ecosystem. And so, you know, they would take certain parcels adjacent to like a developing suburban community, sell that for low-income housing, which Utah is in dire need of. Like the neighborhood where I bought in 2007, 8, I couldn't afford my own house right now just because of how things have shot up. So the idea is that, you know, it's taking this worthless land, which is not a bad way to phrase it in terms of the argument, and then subsidizing it at some level at the state level to do low-income housing. And then all of a sudden you have places for people to, you know, live and grow and own a house, which I think, you know, people want to own a house. They don't want to rent for their whole lives. But somebody like Mike Lee has such a bad track record. This is just one of like a cascading number of efforts. If you remember after the PLI around, well, it was the public lands lawsuit, right? The state of Utah sued the federal government.
Yes.
23 million square acres of land ownership. That has never even been heard, you know, at the Supreme Court level at least. And so it's really undecided. It still exists out there. And so I guess that slippery slope argument, whereas, okay, if Mike Lee were able to get this House bill passed, and I'm not even here to talk about the House bill. Like, it's just something that, you know, I'm using an example.
Yeah.
If he were to get this passed, I see that as a major win for a concerted effort in the West to dispose of what a lot of people see as invaluable landscape, and that to me is the frightening thing with the effort in general. And you know, it's not, Utah's not it's not alone in that, right? Idaho,
sure.
Nevada. I mean, all of these Western states have this sort of
everything west of the Continental Divide.
for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, we're the public land states, right? Like, they don't have that option back east because
Right.
they've already disposed of their public land. You know?
And let's clarify one thing, because we both know what you're saying, but when you're saying cascade, at the bottom of that sort of chasm or waterfall that you're describing is private ownership.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's a fact. And who's going to buy that is like, everyone loves to hate Bill Gates. Well, he's going to have a whole bunch of it. China, actually the Saudis, I believe they're the number one private landowner, or, you know, quote unquote private landowner in America is Saudis. I'm nearly
Followed
positive.
probably closely by China. I mean,
Yeah, I think they're too.
yeah.
But I think, if I recall correctly, fact check me on this, I think the Saudis own more than China by a mile. Like, China's being more strategic about what they buy. That's a whole nother discussion. But the reality is, there's a history of these lands being sold off to some form of private ownership. Canada, actually, I think might be the number one owner of agricultural land in America. I don't think they're going to be rushing to buy up like mule deer sage grouse territory, but so foreign ownership of some kind is what you can expect. You hate Elon Musk? Well, he's going to buy it. In fact, I one time calculated, just for, you know, sort of shits and giggles, to tell people on Twitter, if you sold off every piece of Forest Service and BLM in Idaho at the current market value, it would be something like $108 billion. Sounds like a big number. That's not a big number. Like, relative to somebody like Saudi, or Elon Musk could buy it 3 times.
Sure.
It's like, it's a big number, but not when you're talking about the scale and scope of some of these other entities.
Well, and what those lands represent in terms of the resource that they contain, and some of that's in the form of, you know, extractive resources, but just like the open landscape in general is a resource, and the value of that in the long term, as it's disappearing globally every day, like whatever, how many tens of thousands of acres.
Yeah.
It seems like a very short-sighted play to sell it now, in my opinion, for any reason, right? There's just, I can't see the value in giving someone else control of that, whether it's a state entity or a private entity. I think the status quo ought to be maintained for, you know, as long as it can be, but it's being continually chipped away and eroded. So it's, you know, it's hard to know. There's nothing that says by the time our kids are our age that public lands will exist in the way they do right now.
Right.
The argument is probably that they won't.
It's probably at this stage probably more likely than the former. And if you're a right-wing, politically minded person, which I am, an argument that I think it's much more kind of philosophical, but if you look at people in the West, it's a blessing and a curse, but if you look at Western people, they wouldn't describe themselves this way, but they see the world in like a very sort of Rothbardian, you know, paleo-con, libertarian sort of worldview. And a lot of that is because they live in areas like this, like right here. We can go 2 miles and then there's, I don't know, roughly 4 million acres available just 2 miles up the road.
Right.
So they're free all the time. If they want to get away from people, it's readily available to them. So they have a sort of different view of freedom than someone who grew up in, say, Tennessee. And I love all my friends in Tennessee, but they just view things differently. In fact, before we get into the real meat of stuff, I want to run this little theory by you. It's one of those, I have all these stupid pet theories. If you listen to, I've long said one of the worst things that ever happened to like music, the kind of music that I listen to, is the marriage right from the beginning of country and western.
Okay.
They're two completely different forms of music. Like Dave Stamey is not singing. Well, he's a cowboy singer, so like, why would you? He's not singing the same thing as Johnny Cash.
Okay.
They both are great in their own way, but they're very different. If you listen to a Dave Stamey song, he's talking about sunrises and sunsets and big mountain ranges and moving cattle and not seeing your family for a week and all this kind of stuff. What he's doing is he's expressing both the positive and negative sides of this freedom as he feels it. If you listen to somebody like Chris Knight, for example, great songwriter,
Yep.
when he does this, all of his devices are open road, rivers, railways, the forest or the lake or whatever. It's all the only places they get to experience that whatever that feeling is,
Yeah.
for them, it's only on the freaking highway. Like the freedom of the open road, ever since I was a kid, that sounded like the dumbest shit I'd ever heard in my life. I was like, what are you talking about? This is like, there's rules. How is this freedom?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I can only go this fast. I can't just take a left-hand turn wherever I want.
Yeah.
It's like, out here, I can drive wherever I want. I mean,
Yeah.
not legally, but in theory,
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that kind of shoots out arguments for, okay, if I was on my horse, I could go wherever the hell I wanted. What do you think about that?
In terms of like,
Well, it's just a pet theory. I just want to know how stupid it is, really.
well, I don't know. I mean, I see your point for sure. I think, like that perspective of like living on the open range versus like, living in a place like this, like you do, like your family does, is very, and you and I we've hunted together, we've spent time in the outdoors. For you living in this place versus me coming to this place and spending 3 days, even a week, say a month, say I was just wanting to ride around the mountains with you, but I'm still going back to this other place that's very different. So your reality
prison,
is reflected in, obviously these two genres of music. It's, I don't know though. I think it's tricky because it's almost like, I mean, the divide between rural and urban is only increasingly felt. People have less and less connections to rural life, rural families, to the wild in general. And so it seems like it's just sort of exacerbating these camps in which people are constantly like talking past each other. And so, if Chris Knight wanted to get together with your boy Stamey, I'd like to see him put on a show together, man.
No. So me too. I would definitely buy tickets to that. What I mean is that what I was trying to articulate before about how people that live in these kinds of environments have, and this is probably, I will often say I do not believe that any human being is incapable of removing bias. This is like part of the reason I think it's so stupid to say fair and balanced with news or, just
Sure.
the facts or whatever. It's stupid. You're going to curate that in some way, Well, so expressing my biases, I've always lived like this short of the time in the Army, I've lived in two cities, Ramadi and Salt Lake when I went to college, so it's like I don't have a big touch point there, but so those are my, cards on the table. But I do think just from interacting with people over, almost 40 years now, people out here have a different sense. It's like almost a deeper sense of freedom than, people in these other places,
I think they do have more freedom. I mean, just down to like, building codes and, I mean, what did it take me off the highway? 50, 60 miles to get here. And I didn't have service the entire way. And so in some ways you're free from noise.
Yeah.
Right. Like not just the noise of like traffic, but the noise of like constant bombardment. Unless you choose to like, you know, turn on your television, like you're not just going out to the field and like checking your Twitter feed because you don't have Twitter out in the field. You got to go get connected to it, right? Or you might. I don't know.
Yeah, I do. But
my phone doesn't. Verizon has poor coverage out here.
all my Twitter followers are like, where the hell are you tweeting from then? I do have coverage. But we got the Starlink shit too.
Oh, yeah. You and your boy Musk.
Yeah, my dear friend. Going to put that chip in people's heads.
Right?
Yeah. So, actually, at the very root of that is to say this is one of those, kind of one of the sort of secondary or third effects of having this public land available. It's like that if you're a right-wing minded person and you value this certain definition of freedom, well, it's no more felt than in a place like this. So if you remove that,
yeah,
how do you think your kids are gonna feel? Like Yellowstone, I remember growing up, everyone's like, oh, you've been to Yellowstone or whatever. It's like, yeah, once. It sucks. Like, why would I want to go to Yellowstone, you know? I mean, okay, some shit shoots out of the ground, but otherwise the mountain I live on is way better. I can do whatever I want over here.
Sure.
You know, I go there, there's cops everywhere.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, it's tricky because I think the nexus that really is the wedge for people that, you know, public land issues speaking at least, is this federal ownership. And so, you know, how could, you know, somebody like yourself who, you know, is experiencing this kind of freedom that I agree, you have way over more than, you know, I do live in the city. If I play the radio in my shop too loud, I get a, you know, call from my neighbors, or worse, they don't even bother calling me. They call the cops, right? Yeah. And so like, how can you say, okay, why should the feds own this thing when the state, you know, the state would probably do a better job owning it, less government kind of an idea. Mm-hmm. I would make the argument that states have showed themselves, by and large in the West, poor stewards of managing and holding on to public lands in the long term. What often happens, and I can give you this information after, I don't have it ready, but the amount of public land that states were given at statehood, I'm talking Nevada, Colorado, mm-hmm. the Intermountain West kind of areas, to say nothing of the broader West. Utah, obviously, parts of southern Idaho, Montana. The amount of public land they were given at statehood, there's statistics on how much of that land they have left that, mm-hmm. you know, goes into school institutional trust programs. And a state like Nevada has already sold off like 80% of the public land it was given at statehood. And so it still manages these lands, and they generate revenue for schools, which is great, it's needed. But they haven't maintained it in perpetuity for a long time. So federal government, better or worse, doesn't have to like balance its budget in the way that a state does, right? There's more there's more what's the word I'm looking for? Accountability for states than the federal government. And I would say, you know, we don't know what this November is going to look like, but we don't know what the next, 5, 10, 20 years is going to look like with the federal government. But as it maintains now, and if you look at the sort of organizational missions of something like the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management, or the National Park Service, they have a longer view of the use and conservation and development of these lands, whereas a state, I don't think that has such a long view, and to me that's problematic.
And to kind of add to your point, or bolster it rather, I think a lot of people don't know, I mean, you know this, but a lot of people don't know these states. I don't know about Nevada, but at least Utah and Idaho, I would imagine Nevada as well, they have a provision in their state constitution that says any land that belongs to the state has got to be managed to the best, or let's see, how would you say it? It's got to be used in such a way that will generate the most revenue for the school system.
Correct.
And in a lot of times that means selling it.
Well, almost exclusively means zoning.
Right.
The SITLA, the School Institutional Land Trust Association in Utah, a lot of that SITLA land, that state land in Utah, isn't publicly accessible.
Mm-hmm.
Large swaths of it you can't hunt, so it's public in the sense that the state owns it, but not in the same way. And when they dispose of those parcels, it's almost always getting sold to development or, some kind of like extractive industry or something like that. It's not necessarily in the interest of recreation, of hunting, of fishing, of anything like that.
That might be a good place to talk about the multiple use mandate, actually.
Okay.
So, can you help define? Because we talked about this on the phone recently, but I think a lot of people also just conflate Nat Park, Monument, BLM, Forest Service. They kind of just conflate it all as fed lands or whatever. And these are all managed in quite different ways.
For sure.
And have very different histories.
For sure.
Like the base history, just quickly, the base history of the BLM is TR sent out people and said, okay, we're going to preserve this lands for those yet in the womb of time. One of his best quotes. I mean, that's from a speech, but sort of that's the spirit of it. Go out, survey it, tell us which. This is why you find these ranger cabins all over these mountains and stuff. Go out, survey it, tell us what it can be used for and, how we can best manage it, sort of thing. And they came back and said, okay, here's all the good stuff, Forest Service essentially. Mm-hmm. Here's all the good stuff. Here's this other arid, basically the sagebrush stuff.
You're right.
It's arid. It's pretty much useless. You should probably do something like another Homestead Act or something like that on it. And TR said no, and then it just sort of sat there and floundered for a few years, and then I believe it was 1955, if I remember correctly, when the BLM was formed.
Yeah, around then.
And then, because it just kind of sat as open range for a while.
Yeah.
And then the BLM took over, and this ties into the Bundy thing, which we won't get into today, but then the BLM took over sometime around like 1955, and now they manage it with their own multiple use mandate, which is different and distinct from the Forest Services, and certainly far distinct from, or much different than parks and monuments.
Sure. Well, and I think it's important to note too, BLM is managed through the Department of Interior, whereas Forest Service, is managed through Department of Agriculture, and so they're not even in the same necessary like sections of the federal government, right? Mm-hmm. And so their uses, multiple uses, are they have different goals. I mean, obviously the geography, the flora and fauna is different, but how people use them is different, and how they're able to be used is different. And so you take something like, national monument, right? If you look at if we were to pull up a definition of what a national monument is, it's sort of to preserve this cultural, archaeological, historical significance because it has some unique defining feature, and in parts like southern Utah, a lot of that is archaeological with the, the Native American tribes and some of their sites and things like that, versus something like the BLM, which is, in its initial inception, there wasn't a ton of oil and gas development. We weren't fracking it. We didn't know what the possibilities were. Well, then, fast forward, 50, 60, 100 years, and all of a sudden these lands become, in some ways, the most valuable financially just because of the reserves they're sitting on. Mm-hmm. And so the multiple use mandate came out and sort of said, okay, here's all the acceptable uses. And, they would draft a management plan in consultation with, area biologists, area stakeholders, all the different recreationalists. And so, if your chunk of BLM is, adjacent to the Owyhee or some, unique feature, then they would consider all of that, the various interests in it, whether it's boating, fishing, recreation, grazing, mining, mm-hmm. what have you. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, it just, the BLM particular just came out. I'm sure you caught this, but a new management plan, maybe back in March or April, I'd have to double check. and it added conservation as one of the multiple use like activities that's allowed. And I think that was a significant win for people, anybody who spends time on public land, because I think a lot of times there's this impetus to either develop or this really heavy-handed management, whether it was in terms of like say treatments on P&J or some kind of water project. And I think to change that mandate to say that conservation constituted an acceptable, appropriate use, to me, that struck me as a good thing, because, I mean, how many times have you been out on BLM land that even 10 years ago you could drive forever and not see any real influence of humans other than maybe, a few knocked over barbed wire fences. Mm-hmm. And now it's like it's changed. It's something else. It's either development or it's, well pads or whatever, what have you,
Yeah, so I get worried about that because of Biden's, well, it's not really Biden's, the Nature Conservatory or Conservancy wrote it up, was the whole 30 by 30 initiative, which is really 20 or 50 by 50. And that's perhaps a different discussion as well. But I get pretty nervous because the term conservation is now so vague. I mean, perhaps it always was, but I get pretty worried about, like, when you say, okay, we've got to lock up, that's the term that was used, or the verbiage that was used in the EO, lock up, or if I don't want to lie, I think it was lock up, but it was something along those lines, 30% of America's land and 30% of America's water by the year 2030, mm-hmm. which is right down the road, mm-hmm. and then 50% by the year 2050, and a lot of people started asking questions like, well, wait a minute, where are you going to get this 30%? Because if you took everything, barring Alaska,
yeah,
if you took everything, I think you can only get to about 27% of the country. So it's like, well, where are you coming up with this other 3? And their answer to that was public-private partnership, which is what they always say when they have some slimy thing up their sleeve. And certainly 50% of the land is like, what? Like, so you want to lock up the grain belt and put bison on it, or what are you going to do with those farms?
Right.
So that's perhaps a different discussion, but in spirit,
yeah.
I can understand why you'd feel that way.
No, and I mean, I see your point, because I think when, again, my main interest, my real passion, where my sort of like interest and really heartfelt conviction lie is in sort of like maintaining public access to public resources, and especially in this Intermountain West area, because I mean, you live here. This is my favorite place on the planet. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else.
Yeah.
And so when you take words like conservation, in some other context, like some sort of climate change initiative, like I'm sure climate change is happening. I hope people are addressing it, but I have zero interest in that whole conversation, just because, people only have so much bandwidth. And so I know that the language is getting misappropriated, by both sides, but, sure. but surely by these, broad efforts to, curb carbon or pollution. I don't know. And frankly, yeah, it's worrisome. I mean, I'm not going to say it's not. I mean, I grant you that for sure.
There's a weird thing happening. You don't, you're better than me. You don't get sucked up into Twitter arguments, but I've noticed there's an interesting thing happening. You brought up the rural-urban divide earlier.
Yeah.
There's a segment of the right wing that they're these urban guys, which is obviously is fine. We view the world differently in some ways. But where it becomes interesting is their view of public lands and just nature in general is indistinguishable from somebody like AOC. Like, you read their tweets and I'm like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like, it used to be, if someone took a shot at me for posting a picture of, whatever, grip and grin or something, it used to be reliably they would have a septum piercing and some terrible tattoos.
Yeah.
Now, I'll click on those, and a lot of times they're like following these influential so-called far right or dissident right types.
Huh.
I'm like, this is so.
That is bizarre.
It feels like living in a bizarro world.
Huh.
And my view is there's a segment of the left. We view politics slightly differently, but at least we can have conversations. There's a certain segment of the left, growing segment of the left, that if they could, they would turn everything that's managed by the federal government into like a sort of snow globe,
Just like everything becomes Yellowstone.
Yeah, like you can't access it in any way other than to be on this electric train.
Yeah.
Well, that sort of view of this place is emerging on the right now,
Yeah.
which is so strange. I'm not really one for making too many friends in the center, but like on this issue, it's like, how the hell did I end up? And it's like, I don't know what happened, but I'm somewhere in the center on this thing.
Yeah. I know a few like guys that work for the Division of Wildlife in Utah, and you talked, and those, some of those are super guys, like very knowledgeable, very, very passionate, and they will express frustration over designated wilderness area for one, wilderness study areas, because they see ways in which they could improve the landscape if they could punch a road in there and, do some kind of water treatment or some kind of prescribed burn. And they just like, we can't touch it. And it's like, their hands are tied, and they are. And so that sort of snow globization of nature, public lands specifically, is problematic. I mean, it's the same people that that are opposed to big predator hunting, that don't realize, man has been an apex predator on this landscape for millennia. And so to say, we shouldn't shoot bears, it's kind of nonsensical, really,
Yeah, and it's very first order thinking, right? Because the truth is that ship has long sailed.
Sure.
We're managing all of this shit.
Yeah.
Like whether you want to admit it or not, it is all under the management of man at this point.
Yeah.
Outside of certain areas of Alaska and the Yukon and perhaps some stuff in Brazil, but then you've got, uncontacted tribes. So perhaps like it's maybe Siberia, Yukon, Alaska. Outside of that, we're managing populations everywhere.
Yeah.
We've got the largest contiguous wilderness area in the country, well, in the lower 48.
Frank Church,
here in Idaho. Even those animals migrate into areas or are at least influenced by animals that are under management in other areas.
Yep.
So you can call it, here's what I'd say. If there's any issue on this that I've become a lot more wishy-washy on, it's wilderness, because I love wilderness. But after sitting in the Selway, Bitterroot Selway a couple years ago, watching it burn during an elk hunt, like literally trying to hunt around a wildfire.
Right.
And there was one day where we were like, holy shit, we might want to leave. It's like, now it's coming this way. Sitting there watching all these firefighters, they don't want to sit there and stare at it, but you can't do anything about a burn on a wilderness. You can't touch it. Yeah. So they're just wrapping bridges in, some type of tin or something. And then they were pumping water out of the river on these rainbirds and just spraying bridges. And that was it. And they were just watching it burn. And I was thinking, like, what the hell? Like, this is our idea. You burn down that old growth forest, man. Deer hunting is going to be nice 2 years from now.
Yeah.
But dude, that's going to be a lifetime before it's what it used to be. You know?
No, I mean, and you live right on the edge of it, but you mentioned Yellowstone, which is a really interesting example to me. I lived on the north end of Yellowstone National Park for like 4 or 5 years, and the park itself, I think, is 2 million square acres, but the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is, I want to say 9 or 10.
Yeah, it's about the size of your home state. That's the analogy everybody always uses.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that. That's interesting. But like, so you have this 2 million acres that's completely, hands off. And I mean, they'll shoot problem bears or they'll
Right.
move elk that are, goring tourists that get a little too close. But then you look at like around the park, how land and wildlife and everything is, not just managed, but how it interacts with society, humanity. I think it's a really interesting sort of template for, okay, let's put this one little place in a snow globe and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like the domes down in the desert that they want,
Yeah.
whatever experiment that was.
My favorite are when they fence off like a little 3x3.
Oh yeah, the range fence for the crazy, yeah.
Uh-huh.
But you have this ecosystem that's just this massive, amazing sort of place, and everybody has different ideas, right? Montana versus Idaho, very different ideas on
Mm-hmm.
how we're gonna deal with wolves, how we're gonna, and then the people around it, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if you're from Fremont County, Island Park, just over the hill,
Mm-hmm.
they see very different than if you go to Jackson, Driggs, Victor,
Mhm.
right? And
True.
they're in the same ecoregion, right? They're, as the crow flies, it's what, 50 miles, and yet culturally, you couldn't find people more sort of different in some ways.
True, true, but that's because Teton Valley is like the Valley of Prunes now,
Well, I mean, it's a lot of people that aren't from Wyoming, that's for sure.
Well, Teton Valley, Idaho.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
But same,
Yeah.
it's actually the same on either side. It's like, so, but you're right. And this kind of, I didn't even mean to go here, but here we are. The ESA,
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Nixon, has been, in theory, it was this great idea. In my view, pretty quickly, but at least now has become a political cudgel, and everybody knows it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just used as a weapon at this point. It's not. It's like the grizzly bear biologist that manages the GYE. I remember years ago he was on Ranella's podcast. It was great. It was good to listen to.
Mm-hmm.
Ranella and I don't see eye to eye politically, but on these issues, we're pretty much in lockstep for the most part. He really pressed him a couple of times, like, give me the real number of bears. Like, no one's listening. Tell me the real number.
Right.
And he was like, well, all I can tell you is that based on our data, it's somewhere around 1,200, which is like what they want, in that area. And he's like, do you think it's more than that? And he kind of hinted that he thinks it might be double that. Well, anybody that lives in Island Park is going to tell you, I guarantee you it's double that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the average person doesn't understand the way that they, and this guy talked about it in that show, the way that they come up with this data, in my view, and this is conspiracy, this is my tinfoil hat talking, my view, they use intentionally shitty methods to gather data because they are, at least, if you're a scientist, you're trying to keep your job, one, have enough money to do whatever research it is that you actually want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But your day-to-day job is managing these populations. You're really working on some, at least theoretically, in the romantic sense, you're working on whatever this other idea is.
Yeah.
So he is disincentivized from having accurate data. The government or the management program itself is disincentivized because if they come out and say, look, we have too many bears, that means you're getting rid of bears one way or another.
Yeah.
Are you trapping them and sending them to Oregon, or are you turning on a hunt like Wyoming and Idaho try to do?
Right.
One way or the other, you're getting rid of bears. Well, that's a big, costly, annoying fight. So no one is actually properly incentivized to gather good data. So they run these hair traps, which for anybody who doesn't know is like you take 4 trees and run barbed wire around them, and then use some bait or whatever. And the bear steps over and you collect hair, and then you run a DNA test and you go, okay, this is a different bear than this bear, And so we've had this many bears hit this, and then you make a sort of a model that's all based on projection.
Mm-hmm.
There must be this many known grizzly bear range is X. So given that, there's probably going to be a little bit of overlap here and there. So we can, with some relative accuracy say there are this many bears in this area, and then you run another hair trap. They do camera traps as well. Then you run another hair trap, and you just sort of like aggregate this data, and then you go, okay, it's about this many bears.
Right.
Well, it's not bad data is, in my view, worse than no data at all.
Sure. I mean, with no data, it's just people's opinion, and that changes, the cultural whims of the day, obviously.
Yeah, you're running on vibes, which are sometimes better. Like I would prefer vibes in this case. Like
if you're vibing.
Dude, last time I hunted over there, Island Park area, I was there for 21 days with a bow hunting bears.
Okay. Spring or fall?
Spring.
Okay.
And I saw easily, for every black bear I saw easily 3 grizzly bears.
Really?
Easily.
Wow.
Yeah, it was crazy.
Huh.
Now, timing was a little bit of an issue. Younger male grizz.
This is spot and stock, and you're
Yeah.
moving on your horse and just kind of...
I was just hiking.
Just hiking, okay.
Yeah, there was a couple nights I was like, this is the worst idea I've ever had.
When you glass up a hillside of 3 bears feeding your way.
Dude, I found a claw mark one day, and I think I took a picture, but I was reaching as high as I could on my tiptoes, and I was like, this is such a bad idea. But there was a ton.
Don't let your wife hear this episode.
Oh, she came at the end of that one, and
geez.
something tore that night that she came. So I was tent camping, but I had a camper. I just hike back to some days. She comes to the camper, and that night something, I don't want to tell you which creek we were on, but we were on a tributary of the Henry's Fork, and that night something, I don't know what, tore apart something else in the creek, like right behind it. You could hear it, ripping flesh and water going everywhere and shit. And of course I climb out on the truck with a flashlight, and I'm like trying to figure out what it is. Couldn't see it, but it wasn't a bear. In my mind I thought that's got to be a wolverine, the sound. Maybe it got a hold of a heron or something. We do get the occasional wolverine even in this valley, so it could have been. But either way, it was an interesting trip. The point is, a lot of bears. Now, we were a little early, so that's what I was trying to say, is that's going to be part of the reason you're seeing more grizz than black bears. We were a little early.
Okay.
Like, a lot of sows are not quite out yet. We were around here most years, May 15 is like sweet spot.
Okay.
For spot and stock, because they're still hitting green grass. They haven't got on ants yet. And we were a little earlier than that. So I think that's going to be why. But either way, tons of grizzly bears. A shitload of grizzly bears. And that area is... anyway, there's people that live near and around all of that stuff.
Sure.
And to your earlier point, if you talk to them about how they feel about... I don't want to say unequivocally there's way more bears than the target objective, but it sure seems to be that there's way more. If you're one of those people, you've got a vested interest in, like, hey, man, like, my kid's walking to the school bus, I don't need a bunch of grizzlies right here in town or whatever, which happens in Island Park. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but I'm actually trying to remember how I'm doing that ADHD thing I do, where I'm trying to figure out how that connected to public lands.
We were talking back to the ESA.
So a worry that the ESA is often conflated with, maybe conflated is not the right word. Public lands issues, at least prima facie, are their own thing. The ESA is a thing that is kind of now layered on top of public lands. It still impacts private lands, but people just don't really think about it that way. They think about it as a public lands problem. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, I think if you're trying to be serious and sober about solving, there are problems. I don't think I think we both agree that there are certain problems with management of these. The people that manage it would agree that there are. Yeah. You have to be able to separate things like the ESA from public land management.
Totally. And I'll say one thing about the ESA first before I kind of speak to that point, which I think you made well. I mean, in the inception of the ESA, like the EPA as well, like the Clean Water Act, it was in response to, I would say, over extension of commercialization of agribusiness it happened in response to things like DDT, being sold to agricultural producers and said, hey, you got bugs, this will cure your problem. And it sure did, along with all the, migratory birds. And we saw this huge crash, obviously, and things like that. And so, trumpeter swan, was largely recovered right here, Henry's Lake and, Red Rock Lakes, which is just over there. I think at one point there were 65 nesting pairs of of trumpeter swan at Red Rock Lakes Wildlife Refuge. And that species was basically recovered to the point where you can now have a tundra swan hunt, at least in Utah, and they're very similar. You can tell the difference, but a lot of trumpeters get shot, as you know, during the tundra swan hunt. That would have been unfathomable had it not been for the ESA. Now, fast forward to today, the ESA, to your point about it being a cudgel, it does a lot of litigation, and it ties things up. It extends things. I think one of its benefits today is that it acts as an impetus for states to act. And I'm thinking about sage grouse specifically, because if you remember about 10 years ago, yes, the Environmental Protection Agency was considering listing sage grouse as endangered. And so you saw, in response, states like Idaho, Utah, Wyoming come up with their own sage grouse management plans, allocate money for treatments to help leks and nesting sites. And so, like, the states did not want to cede any more control to the feds than they already had, especially in terms of managing this particular wildlife. And so, in some ways, it kind of was the carrot for these states to be like, okay, we're gonna do something. And then 3-4 years later, I think it was 5 years later, they did another study. They saw some improvements. They decided not to list it. States are all patting themselves on the back. And so I would ask, would they have done that had it not been for the ESA in place?
It's actually a really good point. And no, I happen to know some people who worked on some of those projects that expressly said, we're trying to do this so that we don't end up in the exact situation you described. So I know for a fact that that's part of what was the impetus of that stuff. It's a good point. And really, it's not the ESA itself that's the problem. And a lot of people would say, well, it could be better worded. Dude, no matter how you word something, lawyers are going to find a way to litigate. They're going to. So it's not necessarily the ESA, it's Humane Society for America and some of these other groups that pick an issue and then they weaponize it to their own ends.
And I guess to be fair to the conversation, we started talking about grizzly bears, and it's always that, what a biologist would call a charismatic megafauna, right? That they get the most attention because, they've got these, big black eyes and their cubs are cuddly. And, I think it becomes, for people living on the landscape, I think it's the grizzly bear issue exists as sort of like this easy target for both sides. But I think, on a smaller scale, it's how water tables are doing, our aquifers being depleted too rapidly to recharge, the guy down the street growing alfalfa. Like, when that starts happening, then people start, looking for solutions. And, I like to think that some of that stuff's in place to sort of, manage or at least mitigate some of that. I don't know. I put, I hate to say this, but I put some of that endangered species stuff in the same camp almost as climate change, because like you said, it gets overlaid on to my main concern, which is maintaining access to these places, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, some of these become a distraction that aren't like, I hope somebody's worried about this. It's just not the thing that I necessarily tend to spend my time thinking about and like trying to sort of, you know,
Yeah.
work to improve, or at least work to, extend.
Yeah. No, this area is my, this is where I'm the most shit lib, is on public land stuff, as you know, I'm not a lib, but on this stuff, I tend to align with a lot of Nancy Pelosi types, I guess, on quite a few pieces of this. Now, one form of pushback that will come on something like this is they'll say, well, if the state could manage it, they could manage it better. I think we've already talked at least a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
We've tried that and it didn't quite work. Another thing they'll say is, well, it's theirs to sell. Who cares? Like, what's the point? And
theirs being the feds, or theirs being the states?
The state.
Okay.
And the way I view that, I'd be curious to hear how you view it, but the way I view that is like, imagine you were a middle class guy that lived through like you were a child in the 60s and 70s, and your dad had worked at a factory, but he was super into muscle cars, and he was able to get this like 1970 Chevelle. And now times are a little tougher. You're in the 80s. Paul Volcker's just raised interest rates to 19%. Everyone's feeling it, or 18%. Everyone's feeling it. Things are, the Fed's trying to curb inflation. You just went through the gas shortage. There's all these compounding factors that are making life pretty tough.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got this 1970 Chevelle.
Okay.
And the neighbor down the street knows that, he's clairvoyant in some way. He knows that one day that car is going to be worth $500,000, which is what it's worth now. I think last time I saw it.
The Chevelle?
Yeah, last time I saw one, I think it was
amazing.
$500,000. I know. Can you imagine?
Like,
dude. But so.
Think about all those demolition derby car guys who
no shit when we were
wrecked
kids.
theirs up in the 90s.
Dude, I know. Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's got like a bone crusher spray painted on it or whatever.
Right.
And some farm kid took swather teeth and like welded it to the front.
Punisher.
So here you are in this situation. You're not desperate, but times are tough, and you've got this asset that's got some value, and this guy comes to you and he says, I'll give you $100,000 for that. Well, that's a crap load of money. And forget about adjusting for inflation. We're saying $100,000 in today's money. I don't know what the inflation adjustment would be. One day it's going to be worth $500,000. Well, you're struggling. You could get by and keep that. There's other things you could do. But you're like, well, this would make my life a lot easier. So you sell that Chevelle off for $100K. Well, he then owns this Chevelle. 2024 comes around or whatever, 22, whenever. He sells it off for $500,000. You now have went through all of that period. You probably spent the money on Jordans or something retarded. You know what I mean? and you bought some mixtapes and shit. And you don't have the Chevelle.
Yeah.
And then you also didn't even cash out at the time when it was at its highest value. You sold it like, it's like maybe the Bitcoin people would say like HODL or whatever. I look at the public lands like that. It's like, we're struggling right now. And I can see the argument, like the argument that Ted Cruz made was, if we sold off our public lands, we could pay off our national debt. This was in 2016, before it was 36 trillion or whatever it is now.
Right.
We could pay off our national debt with these. I'm dubious as to whether you actually could have, but let's say he was right. Well, now we would have sold all this shit off, and they would have spent all that money. Maybe they would have paid the national debt off, but we would have still done the CARES Act and all this other stuff, and we'd be right back at 15, 20 trillion in national debt, and we wouldn't have these public lands anymore.
No, man. I think it's the best metaphor. I mean, I love it because I'll say this. I heard it was a number of years ago. It was Sally Jewell, who was the Secretary of Interior under Obama. It was sort of as Obama was leaving office, and they designated Bears Ears as a national monument. This was huge news in Utah at the time. Ultimately the decision was reversed by President Trump, and then it was reversed by President Biden.
Yeah.
But Secretary Jewell was given this talk, and she said, she used this example, and I think it just complements your Chevelle example. She said there's like 1.2 billion Chinese right now or something like that. The growing middle class in China is like 500,000 people. And in her time, 500
million.
500 million people, yeah. She said in her time as Department of Interior Secretary overseeing the national parks, the number of middle-class Chinese coming to the U.S. to visit our national parks superseded like even U.S. visitors at some level. And if you look at that trend, you have people from all over the world who are coming here for one reason. And yeah, for them it's Yellowstone, Geyser, Old Faithful, whatever. But they represent, in my mind, this interest in these public, large-scale places that are still much like they were, in time immemorial. Like, yeah, there's a few more roads, and yeah, there's a few more this, but like Europe doesn't have these kind of places. That's been, paved and done away with years ago. There's no real wild. I mean, they're trying to re-wild it. I mean, if you caught that story, I think it was last winter, they had this gathering of like 112 bison, European bison in Poland. Did you catch that? There's this huge effort to like bring European bison back, but it's like, it was a big news story, and I'm just like, man, we've got that. Like, It's so much more difficult.
I don't want gay Euro bison. We got cool bison.
It's so much easier to protect it now and like maintain the status quo than it is to try to bring it back.
Yeah, that's right.
Think about the amount of conflict we have with bison in the West right now already. What about over there where like there's just that many more people, there's that less land? Like, bison takes a huge landscape to like utilize. And so I don't know. I think any sort of closure to like the public access to these places represents a real threat. And as a hunter, like how many hunting places have you lost over the years where either changed landowners, you had permission to hunt before and now the new guy doesn't let you hunt, or this happened when I was in Montana, on the north end of Yellowstone. There's a drainage. I won't necessarily mention which one, but the guy had owned the south and east side of the road, and he owned like it was 2 or 3 sections. It was a big property, and then a guy that I knew, he had like a 12-acre in-holding. It was a tiny little parcel. But when he sold that 12 acres to the other guy, the guy was able to put a fence across the road. And now, like, it's still public, but who's going to cut down this guy's lot?
You got to have a freaking helicopter to hunt.
Now you got to, go to the state, and then they got to send the sheriff out, and then they cut the lock. Well, they just put the lock back on. Now going to court, and it's like people don't have the bandwidth for that fight. Right. And so that drainage is now lost to the public. And that was not that long ago. That was 15 years ago, right?
Yeah, sure.
So for me, that loss, at any level just, takes away from, our kids and their kids, enjoyment of what you and I, live and breathe for.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to vamp for a second because I asked people on Twitter to ask you questions because I get so much. Normally I wouldn't do this to a guest, but you're a friend, so you have to deal with it. I asked people to ask questions because sometimes I do think some of this shit is just people wanting to argue, right? But anytime I post anything about public lands, I'll get a million questions. So I said, if you have questions, oh, this one's about Bundy. I don't think I'll do Bundy on my own. I don't want to argue with you.
I don't even know what I mean, we have I won't. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, this guy says this is up your alley though.
Okay.
He says, what's his favorite way to cut fence after having a rancher lock the gates?
I'm trying to come up with a snacky comeback. I mean, obviously a pair of dikes aren't big enough. Usually, if you just back over a fence pole or two, you don't even have to bother cutting it. Just run the whole thing over.
Dude, I'll tell you though, growing up. Now, I hate to come after my own people because I'm a bow hunter. Growing up, bow hunters used to be the best. Like, just about anybody would let you bow hunt across their place because they knew you were going to be respectful and stuff. Now, for whatever reason, I blame flat brims, but I blame them for a lot of things. Now, in my home county, no one will let you bow hunt because the guys cut freaking fences. They'll shoot a bull or a buck or whatever, and they'll come down and be like, well, if I go through this fence, they'll be staring at their Onyx. It's not Onyx's fault, but
I know.
They'll look at it and be like, well, if I cut this fence, I can take a mile off my pack out.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I hear it happens. I can't believe in this day and age somebody would do that. Not even like out of respect, but out of fear for their own life. Really. I mean, like, are you kidding me?
True. My buddy Jake would totally shoot somebody over that. Guaranteed.
Here I am with my pair of pliers and I got some guy up top like, I've been waiting for you, buddy.
He busts out his deer rifle. Okay. We kind of talked about wild. Oh, this actually brings a good point. He says, not high on the list, but I'd be interested in your take on wildfires, what states should be doing to mitigate them, and if they have any insights on state-federal cooperation on the issue. Now, I want to just prep that by saying a lot of times, so this is one of the places where lands get sold off because the state, well, I mean, I've sat on both sides of this over the years, but big enough fire, the state does not probably have the money. They probably don't have the surplus to take care of the fire. So the place is either, if it's in the state control, it's either going to burn down or they're going to have to sell it after one or two fires because they'll realize all this other ground is catching on fire. So what would your view on that be?
Man, that's a great question, actually. I think someone, and I'm not making this argument, I think some would argue that the federal government isn't funding the USDA particular in terms of the Forest Service to fight fires. I've heard that argument made, which I don't know about the budgets and you know how much, but I do know, you go into like, I hate to always be drawing these examples from Utah, but that's where I am and that's what I kind of know.
Sure.
The Uinta Wasatch Cache National Forest is the most visited national forest in the country, and I heard that from the supervisor. But you got to remember that includes Alta, Snowbird.
Oh.
So they have that number, but it a lot of that's like skiers and things like that.
Sure.
But you've spent as much time as I have on the Mirror Lake Highway. This same supervisor told me the number of rolls of toilet paper they use on a big weekend like 4th of July or Pioneer Day. And it's an obscene number. Like these lands are being loved to death. And so like the backlog on public federal lands I know exists. Like, does that mean throwing more money at fires? I don't know. It's a great question. I probably don't have a great answer for it, to be honest, because we know fires are getting bigger, hotter, more catastrophic. There's several in southern Utah. I mean, the whole drive up.
I mean, they say that shit. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's a bunch of fires like actively burning right now in southern Utah, and it was smokier and smokier the further north. I got to Tremonton, could barely see the Wasatch to the east by the time I hit Malad. And then, your whole valley is smoked in right now. Are there fires up here as well, or is that all from us?
Of right now. We believe it or not, we catch a lot of. I think it's because of the Gulf Stream, but we catch a lot of California.
Yeah,
smoke.
so do we. So. That wildfire question's a great one. I probably need to think about that because I
don't have a good answer on it either.
Yeah.
Other than that primer. So here's another one for you because the one after this is really good too. This is my buddy who's a elk guide down in New Mexico that I was talking to you about before.
Oh yeah.
He said interested to hear his take on landlocked parcels. You kind of hit some of that, but corner hopping.
Oh, are you kidding me? Sign me up.
Yeah.
This lawsuit that's going on right now in Wyoming.
You may want to describe corner hopping real quick for.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. So in the West. So in the West, there was an impetus by the federal government to have these lands settled, and this is in response to post-Civil War, we had this growing population in the northeast portion of the U.S., and then in the South, they got hit pretty hard, and so a lot of land was a lot of land was lost, a lot of industry was lost, and they were trying to move people west. And so the federal government's answer, along with the Homestead Act, was to encourage railroads to build railways. And so we have the BNSF, Burlington Northern Santa Fe in the north, and Union Pacific down where we are, and say built these transcontinental railways to move people out of the east into the west. And it was largely also to settle the land. Which, obviously dispossessed the natives at the time, but it was also to push the Spanish and the Mexican south so that we could claim that territory.
Manifest destiny.
Right.
Baby.
And so what the federal government said, we're going to divide this, and it's in a checkerboard pattern, and every other parcel is going to be given to the railroad, privatized, and then we will maintain the other pattern. So they're in these 1 mile sections, 640 acres. Mm-hmm. And see, the idea of corner crossing is, if you look at a lot of the West, you have this checkerboard of public and private.
And he's not kidding. It literally looks like a checkerboard.
Oh, 100%. You could play checker from here to Manitoba. Really.
Yeah, a lot of it.
Without ever getting kinged, right?
Sure.
So the railroad over time sold a lot of that land to farmers and settlers, and it became privatized. And so you have all these mile sections. And so the idea of corner hopping is where one corner of public land, and it's almost 100% always
two corners.
Well,
or two pieces, one corner.
I was going to say, one corner would abut another corner, so it would create this X, and it's always divided by barbed wire fence. That the idea is, because you're not technically touching either side of the private, you could hop that fence, you could cross that corner and never leave public land. Mm-hmm. It was recently challenged in the state of Wyoming.
Was it Montana?
Wyoming.
It was Wyoming?
Yeah. It was heard in the first court, and I want to say the court found it in favor of the corner hoppers. So these individuals, did you see the picture of the ladder they built? So
I think
they actually they welded together two ladders into an A-frame because they didn't want to touch the fence. They had thought about it. I think it was 3 or 4 guys. They erected it on this corner. They climbed their self-made welded ladder up and over the corner. They killed this elk. Well, it's adjacent to this large private landholder who sued. So they won in the first court. The large landowner is appealing the decision, obviously. Mm-hmm. But if you every hunter at this point uses Onyx that I know.
Yeah.
Onyx did a study with, I want to say Backcountry, it was TRCP. And they did
Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Park.
Right. They did a study of all of the landlocked public sections in the West, right? So these are sections of public land that you can't get to like without crossing through private at some level. It was 5.4 million acres.
Wow.
I remember that number.
Wow.
And so from a public land hunter's perspective, the idea of crossing a corner to access what I consider our public land,
Sure.
5.4 million
That's
acres.
a lot, man.
That's 2.5 Yellowstones
Yeah.
of country that had been
Wow.
untouched except for, the guy and his kids who owned it and, may or may not hunt and may not let people on it. So I'm a huge proponent of corner crossing. And I think this Wyoming decision really should be like a bellwether case for all Western states. If it passes in Wyoming through a second court and through a second hearing, I think it needs to become a federal mandate and not let states decide. And corner crossing just needs to be legal on all public land.
I completely agree. I just heard a camera make a weird noise, so I'm afraid we might have lost one.
Okay.
Hopefully it wasn't yours. So let's just end it there, and we'll do it again one day.
Yeah,
whenever
sounds
you got
great.
time. Even if I have to come down to your shop.
Wait, that's my favorite hangout. Yours is cool, but I like mine too.
Okay, brother. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll hit you up after your fish trip.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Thanks, man.
Yeah,
Appreciate
buddy.
you.
All right.